easy. Yo, you seen that? Nothing getting too easy. Yo, you seen that?
The afternoon had started like any other for the guys. The sound of cars, people laughing, distant birds singing, the usual hum of daily life, and the occasional honking of. That day in Hornsman, everything seemed to come together. The few quiet moments were comforting to Dees, who had become used to the hustle and bustle of his existence. Every morning, as a ritual and a chance to refocus, he made coffee at the shop. In the midst of the never-ending whirlwind of being a father, an entrepreneur, a newer parent, and a public figure, he had been going to the same cafe for years, finding solace in its warm atmosphere and gentle lighting, which the place was known for. Mendeecees was able to act like a normal guy instead of someone who was constantly being observed because of its subtle appeal and location down a side street where he could temporarily escape the cameras, the rumors, and the prying eyes of the world. Had to frequently strike a balance between fatherhood and celebrity, but tonight everything felt different. Something was happening in the air, something that would change everything as Men sipped his coffee. I recognized him when his son, Lil, came in through the cafe door, but he wasn't acting like himself. I was immediately drawn in by something about his movement and stance. Normally confident, but sometimes brazen, tonight there was a silent tempest boiling beneath the surface. Something flickered as his son's gaze flitted tensely across the room before focusing on him. Moses put down his cup and turned to face him, possibly out of resentment or annoyance. Although he couldn't identify it currently, he could feel that something wasn't quite right. In the end, this incident would permanently change their relationship. Moses, the little one, called. He tried to comfort his son in a calming voice. "Man, what's going on? Something seems to be on your mind." Instead of answering right away, Lee stood there for a long time, his eyes meeting his father's, his palms trembling a little. He moved slowly and deliberately toward me, and I could feel the constriction in his sides. I briefly pondered whether the boy would sit down and work things out, but Lil suddenly lifted his hand and gave me a slap. Suddenly and unrelentingly hit, causing a loud enough echo to draw attention from everyone in the quiet cafe. The effect was both physical and emotional, and everything I had considered came to pass in a single swift action. His mind was racing as he attempted to comprehend the situation, and he knew how his connection with his son had deteriorated. The slap burnt his face, and he felt a mixture of anger, denial, and uncertainty.
Check me out. I'm on my way to the gym, and this one right here, hating on me, trying to make me stay in the house and wait for her. I'm on this. Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am? What? I'm giving Mendeecees, baby. That's what I'm giving. That's what I'm giving. That's what I'm giving. I'm giving Mendeecees. I'm talking about giving another.
Even though the slap was still new to him, the fact that his kid had hit him caused more pain. It was a declaration of something much more significant, a breach between them that had been brewing for years than merely a physical act. But for men, it was more than just a show. It was a betrayal and a scathing public assault by the one person he had spent so much time trying to protect, mentor, and educate. As though it were a spectacle, several of the spectators gasped, and others pulled out their phones to photograph the moment. Standing, Mendeecees kept his hands hanging near his cheek. Standing before him with a severe, angry look was his son Lil, who had once looked up to him and trusted him with everything. For the first time, Mendeecees saw the agony his son was hiding, and Lil's eyes were wide with a mix of defiance and frustration. It felt like the release of years of unspoken stress, but he wasn't sure whether this was about more than just a quarrel. Why did Mendeecees say it at last? He stepped back, his body shivering slightly from the physical sting and the understanding that his kid had just treated him disrespectfully in front of everyone. His voice was quiet but full of passion. Leo simply stood there without replying. He appeared incapable of looking his father in the eye, with his fists clenched and his head bent. He exuded a burning fire that only intensified as the wrath escalated. You can't just quit trying to catch your breath. This isn't how we deal with problems. He was at a loss for words. How could he have known that the flesh and blood of his son would attack him in this way? How was he able to foresee this? There was silence in the room. While everyone else watched, hoping for a resolution, Mendeecees could not focus on the shocked faces or the phone cameras. All he saw was his small baby, the boy he had. His heart was exploding, and his voice was hardly more than a whisper. "Raised in battle for," he yelled. "What's going on with you? Why did you do that? How had they gotten here?" Lil asked, noticing for a moment a hint of fragility beneath his son's hard exterior. He witnessed the pain, confusion, and overwhelming emotions that Lil had been repressing for too long. "I'm not sure, dude. You're always too busy. You never listen. You think you know what's best for me, but you're not there when I need you. You're always so caught up in everything else, and I'm just left to deal with it." Lil's voice was full of anger and something else, and it broke N's heart. He had always been proud to be a father, but perhaps he had overlooked his son's emotional needs in his pursuit of achievement. He had failed Lil in the one way that counted most. He hadn't been there when Lil needed him most. He had never realized how much Lil had been frustrated by the silent battles he fought alone in an effort to be everything to everyone. "I'm sorry," Mendeecees said softly, his voice hoarse with sorrow. "I didn't know. I thought I was doing what was best for you. I never wanted to push you away." Standing before him, Lil was still enraged, but his anger was waning and vanishing into a mist of doubt. "I'm just not sure." Mendeecees knew that this was just the beginning and that they had a lot to work through and rebuild, but there was a tiny spark of understanding at that moment that might just help them both find their way back to each other. The calf remained silent as the two stood there, father and son, the weight of the moment falling about them as he muttered, "I need you, Dad, but you're always somewhere else." While several spectators pulled out their phones to photograph the scene as if it were a spectacle, Mendeecees saw it as a harsh blow and a betrayal. In the hush that hovered between them, the once shocking smack had been forgotten. Even while his flesh still ached from the slap, the deeper pain was that his kid had hit him. In addition to being a physical act, it was a declaration of something far more significant, a long simmering gap between them. For a brief minute, time seemed to stop as the one person he had put so much effort into teaching, protecting, and guiding openly insulted him, breaching the trust he had always felt they shared. Lil, his son, who had once looked up to him and trusted him with everything, was now standing in front of him with a stern, angry face as Dad stood there with his hand still hanging near his cheek. Lil's wide eyes were a mix of frustration and rebellion, and Mendeecees realized for the first time how much agony his son was hiding. This moment seemed like the release of years of unspoken stress, but he wasn't sure if it was about more than just a quarrel. The physical agony and the knowledge that his kid had just treated him disrespectfully in front of everyone caused his body to tremble a little as he took a step back. Leo remained silent, his head lowered and his fists clenched as though he was incapable of looking his bee in the eye. A scorching fire that was only growing greater emanated from him as wrath. "Leo, what the devil is wrong with you?" He stopped attempting to regain his breath and was at a loss for words as he bubbled to the top. How could he have predicted this kind of outburst from his son, his flesh and blood? Everyone was watching, waiting for a resolution, and the room was now quiet, but Mendeecees was unable to concentrate on them, the surprised expressions, or the phone cameras. He was only able to see Lil, his son, whom he had fought and reared. What had brought them here? Mendeecees, whose heart was shattering, demanded in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. Leo looked up, and Mendeecees caught a fleeting glimpse. He saw the pain, the confusion, the overwhelming emotions that Lil had been suppressing for too long, and he saw a hint of tenderness beneath his son's hard exterior. "I'm not sure, dude," Lil whispered, his voice shaking with anger and something deeper. "You're always too busy. You never listen. You think you know what's best for me, but you don't. You're always so caught up in everything else, and I'm just left to deal with it," he said. M's heart sank as the words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had always been proud to be a parent, but perhaps his ambition for success had caused him to overlook his son's emotional needs. Lil's degree of annoyance Moses had let his kid down in the one way that counted most. He hadn't been there for Lil when he was needed most. "I apologize for the silent battles he fought by himself, trying to please everyone." With regret in his voice, Messi murmured softly, "I just felt I was doing what was best for you, and I never meant to push you away." Standing before him, Lil was still enraged, but his anger was waning and vanishing into a mist of doubt. The two stood there, father and son, the weight of the moment weighing on them as the diner remained silent. He muttered, "I just don't know anymore," his voice cracking. "I need you, Dad, but you're always somewhere else." For men, it was a day when everything seemed to come together. The world outside was filled with the usual hum of everyday life, the sound of cars, people laughing, birds chirping in the background, and the odd honking of horns. The afternoon had started off like any other at Men's. There was a small glimmer of understanding that might just help them both find their way back to one another, but the startling slap had been forgotten in the hush that hovered between them. Dee took comfort in his morning coffee and the little minutes of peace once he had adapted to the craziness of his existence. Tucked away on a side street, the cafe was renowned for its understated elegance and provided him with a moment's respite from the world's gaze, the cameras, and the gossip. In the midst of the never-ending maelstrom of being a father, a businessman, and a public figure, it was a ritual for him to pause and think. However, something felt different on this specific day. There was a change in the atmosphere, something that was. Mendy was sipping his coffee when his son, Lil, came in via the cafe door. Something about the boy's stance and movement took me off guard. He wasn't acting like himself. Normally, Lil was confident and sometimes bold, but tonight, a silent storm was brewing beneath the surface. Something that may have been annoyance or hatred flickered in his son's eyes as they flitted nervously around the room before settling on him. Mendy set his cup down and turned to face him. He could sense that something wasn't quite right, but currently he couldn't identify it. Anything that exists between them, Lil Mees described his son's voice as warm to reassure him. "Man, what's going on? Something seems to be on your mind." Instead of answering right away, Lil stood there for a while, his hands quivering slightly at his sides as his father's eyes remained fixated on him. As he approached me slowly, I could feel the tension in the air. For a brief moment, I thought maybe the boy would sit down and work things out, but then Lil suddenly raised his hand, and the slap was so hard and sharp that it turned every head in the quiet cafe. In one swift motion, the impact was not just physical but also emotional. Motion violated the trust he had always felt they shared and was a betrayal and scathing public attack by the one person he had tried so hard to protect, train, and nurture. A mixture of astonishment, disbelief, and wrath ignited deep inside him as his face ached from the smack and his thoughts raced, attempting to make sense of what had just happened. For men, it was no spectacle, but many spectators gasped, and others pulled out their phones to capture the moment. His flesh still ached from the hit, but what really affected him was his son's suffering. It hit him, and it was more than just a physical act. It was a declaration of something far more important, a long brewing breach between them. Time appeared to pause for a second. His hands were still hanging near his cheek as Missy stood there, staring at his son Lil, who had previously looked up to him and trusted him with everything. Now he had a severe, angry look. Mendeecees became aware for the first time of the suffering his kid was trying to hide. Lil's wide eyes were a mix of defiance and frustration, but he wasn't sure whether this was about more than a quarrel. Mendeecees was finally able to express his feelings since it felt like the release of years of unspoken strain. He stepped back, his body quivering slightly from the physical pain and the knowledge that his kid had just treated him disrespectfully in front of everyone. His voice was low-pitched but emotionally intense. Instead of answering, Lil simply remained there, his head lowered and his fists clenched as though he was unable to look his father in the eye. A scorching fire that only grew greater emanated from him as wrath. The tension that was rising to the surface was broken by Lil M's voice. "What the hell is wrong with you?" He stated, "This isn't how we handle things," after expressing uncertainty about how he could have foreseen this. This is how blood would lash out at him. Now the room was silent, and everyone watched, trying to figure out what was going on, but Mendeecees couldn't focus on them, the horrified faces, or the cameras on the phones. He had reared and battled for Lil, his kid, and that was all he could see. How did they get there? What had brought them here? Heartbroken, Mendeecees demanded in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, "What's the matter with you? You did that, but why?" Mendeecees caught a glimpse of weakness beneath his son's hard exterior when Lil looked up. He witnessed the pain, confusion, and strong emotions Lil had been repressing for too long. Lil muttered in a shaky voice, "You're always too busy and never pay attention," with fury and something deeper. "Even though it seems like you know what's best for me, you never support me when I need you. Instead, you're constantly so busy with other things that I'm left to deal with problems on my own." Mendeecees had always been proud to be a parent, but he may have had overlooked his son's emotional needs in his pursuit of achievement. He had failed Lil in the one way that counted most. He hadn't been there when Lil needed him most. He had never realized how much Lil had been frustrated by the silent struggles he waged alone in an attempt to be everything for everyone. The words struck Mendeecees like a ton of bricks, and his heart fell. "I'm sorry." He spoke it softly, his voice rasping with regret. "I just felt I was doing what was best for you, and I never meant to push you away." He said, "I need you, Dad, but you're always somewhere else always." Lil was standing in front of him, his rebellious edge vanishing into a fog of bewilderment, but he was still furious. "I simply no longer know." The smack that had been shocking had been forgotten in the calm that hung between them, and the cafe was still quiet. Even though Moses was aware that this was just the beginning and that they still had a lot to resolve and rebuild, there was a sliver of insight at that very moment. A moment that might lead them both back to each other.